She was humiliated at work by the millionaire, but after winning the lottery, she becomes his new boss. And now she decides to make him fall in love with her. A firm knock on the table made Madison Carter freeze in her place. At 32, she never imagined she would be in this situation, standing in front of dozens of co-workers at Vertex Investments while Richard Sterling, the 38-year-old CEO, publicly humiliated her. Incompetence has a name, and today it's Madison Carter. His cutting voice echoed through the open-plan office on the 47th floor of one of Chicago's most prestigious skyscrapers. "Do you have any idea how much your mistake has cost this company?" Madison pressed her lips together, feeling the metallic taste of blood where her teeth had pressed against the inside of her cheek. The quarterly report she had prepared contained an error in one of the financial projections, an error she had tried to correct as soon as she realized it. But Richard had made a point of exposing at the meeting with the shareholders. "Mr. Sterling, I can explain," she began, but was interrupted by an abrupt gesture of his hand. "Explain? You've just made our company look amateurish in front of the country's biggest investors." Richard ran a hand through his perfectly groomed dark hair, his $5,000 Italian suit moving like a second skin. "Do you know how much money we manage year? Billions. And you make a rookie mistake?" The gazes of his colleagues burned into his skin. Madison could feel the mixture of pity and relief on their faces, pity for her, and relief that it wasn't them instead of her. Her navy blue blazer, which had always made her feel professional and secure, now seemed to suffocate her. It was a typo that was corrected immediately in the official documents, she managed to say, her voice firmer than she expected. The correct figures were presented before any decision was made. Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Ah, so now you're trying to minimize your incompetence? Typical of someone who managed to get to the position of senior analyst through, well, we all wonder how, don't we?" The blood rushed to Madison's face. 5 years of hard work, sleepless nights, sacrifice weekends all boiled down to a barely disguised sexist slur. "My track record speaks for itself, Mr. Sterling," she replied, straightening her posture. "You brought 3 of the biggest clients into the company in the last year. And now you potentially lost them all with this fiasco." He moved closer, his expensive perfume invading her personal space. "You have until the end of the day to clean out your desk. You're fired." The world seemed to slow down. Madison watched, as if out of her own body, as Richard turned to the unwitting audience. "That sets an example for everyone. At Vertex, we don't tolerate mediocrity." She didn't remember returning to her desk. Her hands moved automatically, putting her belongings into a cardboard box. The photo of her parents, killed 3 years ago in a car accident. The small cactus that her best friend, Ashley, had given her as a present. The Stanford MBA diploma that now seemed to mock her. "Mad, I'm so sorry," Ashley whispered, approaching her desk. "Richard is being an idiot. Everyone knows you're the best analyst we have." Madison forced a smile. "We had," she corrected softly. "Don't worry, Ash. I'll be fine." But as she rode down the panoramic elevator, watching the city she loved so much stretch out below her, Madison felt something other than humiliation and anger. A growing determination took shape in her chest. In her apartment that evening, sitting on her sofa with a glass of red wine, she did something she had never done before. She bought a lottery ticket. It wasn't her style to bet on such improbable odds, but something that day pushed her to do differently. "One day," she muttered to herself, tucking the ticket into her purse, "you'll regret underestimating me, Richard Sterling." What Madison didn't know was that lottery ticket, bought in a moment of desperation and defiance, was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. And Richard Sterling? He was about to learn that fate has a very peculiar sense of humor. The sound of the doorbell woke Madison up the next morning. She had fallen asleep on the sofa, still dressed in her clothes from the day before, her empty wine glass on the coffee table. Ashley was standing in her doorway, holding coffee and a box of donuts. "I came prepared for a moaning session," her friend announced, walking unceremoniously into the apartment. "But you look surprisingly good for someone who just got fired by the biggest jerk in Chicago." Madison grabbed one of the coffees, allowing herself a small smile. "Maybe because I decided I'm not going to give him the pleasure of seeing me defeated. That's my girl." Ashley threw herself down on the sofa. "So what's the plan?" Before Madison could answer, her phone vibrated. It was a notification from the state lottery app. She frowned, remembering the ticket she'd bought the night before. "Wait a minute," she muttered, opening the app. Her eyes widened. She checked again. And then again. "Mad? You look like you've seen a ghost." Madison held out the phone to Ashley, her hand shaking. I think I just won $347 million. Ashley's scream probably woke up the whole building. The next few hours were a blur of calls to the lottery, consultations with lawyers and financial planners. Madison opted to receive the prize in annual installments instead of the reduced lump sum, a decision that her years of financial experience made obvious. 2 weeks later, Madison was sitting in an elegant office in New York, wearing a tailored Chanel suit. In front of her, Benjamin Walsh, CEO of Walsh Group, one of the country's largest investment conglomerates, smiled approvingly. "Your proposal is fascinating, Miss Carter," he said, leafing through the documents in front of him. "Using your winnings as seed capital to acquire a majority stake in Vertex Investments? Quite audacious." "Vertex is undervalued," Madison explained, her voice calm and professional. "Its shares fell 12% in the last quarter due to questionable decisions by current management. With the right structure and new leadership, it could easily double its value in 18 months. Benjamin leaned back in his leather chair. "And you want Walsh Group to come in as a strategic partner?" "Exactly. My capital, added to the resources and experience of your group, would be enough to take control of the company." Madison took a calculated pause. "And I know you're looking to expand your presence in Chicago." A slow smile spread across Benjamin's face. "You know, when my secretary said that a former Vertex analyst wanted to see me, I thought about turning her down. But there's something about you, Madison. You remind me of myself 30 years ago." He held out his hand. "Let's make it happen." In the days that followed, Madison plunged into a world of secret meetings, confidential documents, and corporate strategies. The Walsh Group mobilized its legal team, and the hostile takeover began to take shape behind the scenes. In his new penthouse apartment in Chicago, Madison watched the city lights as he finalized the last details with his team via video conference. "The offer will be presented to the board tomorrow," informed David, his lead lawyer. "Inside sources indicate that Richard Sterling has no idea what's coming." Madison touched the pearl necklace around her neck, a gift she had given herself to celebrate her new life. "Perfect. I want to be there when he finds out." Madison, Ashley, who was now working as her executive assistant, called out softly, "Are you sure about this? About going back there?" Madison turned to her friend, her eyes shining with determination. "I've never been so sure. But don't worry, it's not about revenge." She paused, a small smile forming on her lips. "It's about justice, and maybe a little about showing Richard Sterling that he made the biggest mistake of his life by underestimating me." What Madison wouldn't admit, not even to herself, was that there was something more. Something in the way Richard had looked at her that last day, a glimmer of something other than contempt in his eyes. Something that made her wonder if, under all those layers of arrogance and power, there was a man worth getting to know or changing. Tomorrow, she would find out. And this time, she would be the one dictating the rules of the game. The Vertex Investments boardroom was as silent as a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his usual expression of supreme confidence slightly shaken as he read the documents in front of him. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, running his hand down his navy blue silk tie. "A hostile takeover bid? Who the hell thinks they can?" The tempered glass doors opened, and Madison Carter entered the room, followed by Benjamin Walsh and a team of Walsh Group executives. Richard froze, his eyes widening for a split second before narrowing in recognition. "Good morning, gentlemen," Madison greeted the board with a professional smile. Her white Channel dress and Louboutin heels were a modern suit of armor, each piece chosen to convey power and confidence. "I believe you've already had time to review our proposal." "Madison?" Richard stood up abruptly, his chair moving back a few centimeters. "What kind of joke is that?" "No jokes, Mr. Sterling," Benjamin Walsh interjected, his imposing presence silencing any further protest. "Ms. Carter, in partnership with Walsh Group, is making a formal offer for a majority stake in Vertex Investments." The board members exchanged nervous glances. Gerald Matthews, the most senior of them, cleared his throat. "The offer is substantial, and Walsh Group's track record is impeccable." "That's absurd!" Richard slapped the table. "She was an analyst less than a month ago. How can she even be involved in something like this?" Madison kept her composure, approaching the table with measured steps. "Interesting how circumstances change, isn't it, Richard? A few weeks ago, you were questioning my competence. Today, I'm offering 40% above market value per share." She watched as realization slowly spread across his face. Richard had always been attractive in a classic way, said jaw, piercing green eyes, athletic build even in a business suit. But now, with his defenses down and vulnerability exposed, there was something almost magnetic about his presence. "The shareholders need to be consulted," he argued, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "They already have," Madison smiled, sliding another document across the table. "We have signed commitments from most of the major shareholders, including your own sister, Caroline." Richard paled. Caroline Sterling, who controlled 15% of the company's shares through her family trust, had always been critical of her brother's management. "How did you? Let's just say that your sister was very receptive when I presented my vision for the future of Vertex." Madison paused deliberately. "Apparently, I'm not the only one who thinks this company needs a change of leadership." The board voted unanimously in favor of the acquisition 2 hours later. Madison watched Richard leave the room, his shoulders visibly tense under his Italian suit. For a moment, she felt an unexpected pang of something. Empathy? Attraction? She pushed the thought away. "Congratulations, Madison," Benjamin hugged her briefly. "You're officially the new CEO of Vertex Investments." Later, in her new office, Richard's old office, Madison found a framed photo in one of the drawers. It showed a younger Richard with his sister Caroline, both smiling in front of a small commercial building. On the back was an inscription: "Vertex's first office, 2010. Dream start small." She traced the image with her fingers, noticing the genuine happiness in his eyes. Where had the young entrepreneur full of dreams gone? And why, even after everything, did she care to know? "Miss Carter?" Ashley entered the office. "Richard Sterling is here. He says he needs to discuss the terms of your tenure at the company." Madison put the photo back in the drawer. "Send him in." When Richard entered, the air between them seemed charged with electricity. Defiance, resentment, curiosity, and something else, something dangerously close to attraction, hovered in the space between them. "So," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "I guess you're my boss now." Madison stood up, coming around the table to face him squarely. "Yes, I am. The question is, are you prepared to deal with it? Their eyes met, and for a moment, all the corporate masks fell away. It was just a man and a woman, connected by a complex history of power, pride, and, perhaps, something deeper that neither of them was ready to admit. Madison's first week as CEO of Vertex was a complex dance of power and adaptation. Her first decision surprised everyone: to keep Richard Sterling as Chief Operating Officer, reporting directly to her. "Are you sure about this?" Ashley asked during their lunch in the exclusive restaurant on the top floor of the building. "After everything he's done?" Madison watched the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Vertex is his family's legacy, Ash. Besides," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "there's something about him that's changed since the takeover. Something that intrigues me." Indeed, the changes in Richard were remarkable. The arrogant man who had publicly humiliated her seemed to have given way to someone more contemplative, more human. She often caught him watching her during meetings, not with resentment, but with a curiosity that made her heart race inexplicably. "Madison?" His voice surprised her as she reviewed reports in her office that afternoon. Richard was standing in the doorway, holding a folder. "I had the restructuring figures you asked for. Come in." She gestured to the chair in front of him. When he sat down, she noticed that he had loosened his tie, a small sign of vulnerability that the old Richard would never allow. "These are the departments with the greatest potential for optimization," he explained, leaning over to point to grass in the report. His perfume, a sophisticated blend of sandalwood and bergamot, invaded Madison's senses. "Interesting that you suggested cuts in the administrative area and not in the operational teams," she commented, genuinely impressed by his analysis. "I've recently learned that people are numbers on a spreadsheet," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with surprising intensity. The moment was interrupted by Madison's phone. "It's the Walsh Group," she said, checking the identifier. "Sure, I'll lead you to it." Richard stood up, but stopped at the door. "Madison? Thanks for giving me a second chance." That evening, during a company benefit dinner at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Madison couldn't take her eyes off Richard. He looked especially dapper in his tuxedo, chatting with ease with investors and partners. "He looks different," Benjamin Walsh commented, approaching her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Your little experiment seems to be working." Madison accepted the glass, adjusting the red dress that hugged her curves. "It's not an experiment, Ben. It's complicated. Be careful," he warned gently. "Romance in a corporate environment can be dangerous." "There is no romance," she protested, perhaps a little too quickly. The orchestra began to play a waltz, and Richard appeared beside her, as if materialized from thin air. "Would the new CEO do me the honor of this dance?" Before she could think twice, Madison found herself in his arms, spinning around the marble hall. Richard's hand on her waist was firm but gentle, and their bodies moved in perfect sync. "You look stunning tonight," he murmured, close enough for only her to hear. "Richard," she began, but he interrupted her gently. "No, let me do the talking. Since you took over the company, I've seen everything through different eyes. The way you lead, the way you treat people, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about success and power." Madison felt her heart racing. "People can change," she replied, her voice softer than she had intended. "Yes, they can," he smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his green eyes. "Some people inspire us to be better." The song ended, but they remained close for a moment longer than necessary. Madison could feel the curious glances of the guests, the speculative whispers. "I think we're talking," she commented, taking a step back. "Let them talk," Richard replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Some things are worth the risk." Back in Chicago, the next morning, Madison found a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a single photo, the same one she had found in Richard's drawer, showing him and Caroline in Vertex's first office. But now there was a new inscription on the back. Sometimes we need to lose something to understand its true value. And sometimes what we find afterwards is even more precious than what we lost. Or, Madison traced the words with her fingers, an involuntary smile forming on her lips. In her chest, a silent battle raged between reason and heart, between the past and the possibilities of the future. The intercom rang. "Miss Carter? Mr. Sterling is here for the strategy meeting." Madison put the photo in her bag, settled back in her chair, and tried to ignore the way her pulse raced at the sound of his name. "You can send him in." The news exploded on a Thursday morning. Romance at the top, Vertex Investment CEO involved with ousted ex-executive? The headline in the Wall Street Journal made Madison choke on her coffee. "Have you seen this?" Ashley burst into her office, tablet in hand. "There are photos of you and Richard dancing at the Metropolitan. Social networks are buzzing." Madison examined the images. Taken during the charity ball, the photos showed seemingly intimate moments between her and Richard. The way he held her during the dance, the smiles exchanged, the body language that betrayed an undeniable chemistry. "The council is calling an emergency meeting," Ashley continued, "and Benjamin Walsh has already called 3 times this morning." As if by invocation, Richard appeared in the doorway, his countenance tense. "Can we talk?" Ashley discreetly withdrew, closing the door behind him. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. "This could damage everything you've achieved," Richard finally said, his voice laced with concern. "Your credibility, our credibility," Madison corrected, standing up. "You're involved in this too. It's different for you. You're the CEO. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm the man you defeated and kept around. Do you know how that sounds?" Madison moved closer to him, feeling that familiar electric current between them. "And what's it really like, Richard?" Their eyes met, and for a moment, all corporate worries seemed to melt away. Richard took a step towards her, further reducing the distance between them. "Actually," he murmured, "I'm falling in love with a woman who changed my life in every possible way." Madison's heart leapt, but before she could reply, her phone rang insistently. It was Benjamin Walsh. "Madison," Benjamin's voice sounded deep. "I'd just heard that Caroline Sterling is selling her shares." "What?" Madison exchanged an alarmed glance with Richard. "But she supported the takeover. Apparently, she thinks that the personal involvement between you and Richard could compromise the management of the company. Other shareholders are starting to question it too." After hanging up, Madison turned to Richard, who had been listening to the whole conversation. "Your sister, I'll talk to her," he assured her, heading for the door. But he stopped before he left, turning to Madison with a determined expression. "I'm not going to let you destroy everything we built, or what we're building between us." The next few hours were a whirlwind. Madison navigated tense board meetings, conference calls with worried investors, and a flurry of speculative emails. By late afternoon, she was exhausted. "Come in," she answered the knock on her door, expecting it to be Ashley with more damage reports. Instead, it was Caroline Sterling. "We need to talk," Richard's sister declared, elegant in her gray suit. "About my brother, and about the future of Vertex." Madison gestured for her to sit down. Caroline was the picture of controlled sophistication, but there was something in her eyes concerned, perhaps. "Richard was always brilliant at business," Caroline began, "but terrible at relationships. When our parents died, he channeled all his grief into work, turning into that arrogant man you knew." Madison listened attentively, beginning to better understand the man she was falling in love with. "But since you took the over," Caroline smiled slightly, "it's like I have my brother back." The Richard I knew before all the power and bitterness. "So why sell your shares?" Madison questioned. "Why not give us a chance?" "Because I need to be sure," Caroline answered simply. Certainty that this isn't just some poorly planned redemption story, but something real. Something strong enough to survive public scrutiny and corporate pressures. At that moment, Richard burst into the office, stopping abruptly at the sight of his sister. "Care?" The look the siblings exchanged was full of family history and unresolved emotions. Caroline stood up, straightening her Hermes bag. "I came to see for myself," she said, looking from Richard to Madison. "And now I know what I need to do." When she left, Madison and Richard were silent, the weight of the last few hours hanging between them. Outside, the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the office in golden hues. "You know," Richard finally said, "I spent years building walls around myself, protecting myself. And then you came along, with your lottery and your determination, and started tearing every one of them down." Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. "Richard, no." He moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Let me finish. If we're going to face this, the press, the shareholders, my sister, I want it to be by being completely honest. I love you, Madison Carter. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid to admit it." The moment their lips met, Madison knew that some battles were worth all the risks. Even if the entire corporate world was watching. "Extraordinary board meeting in 15 minutes, Ashley announced, rushing into Madison's office the next morning. "And you need to see this." She held out her tablet, showing the front page of the Financial Times. The headline made Madison freeze. "Scandal at Vertex, ex-CEO planned on ousting? Sources allege conspiracy between Sterling brothers." "That's ridiculous," Madison muttered, but her heart raced. The lead photos showed Richard and Caroline in a cafe 2 days before the hostile takeover. The article suggested that the Sterling brothers had orchestrated the whole situation from Madison's dismissal to the sale of Caroline's shares, as part of an elaborate scheme to overhaul the company's leadership. His phone vibrated with a message from Richard. "We need to talk. It's important." "Not now," she replied, typing quickly. "Counsel in 10 minutes." The meeting room was electrically charged when Madison entered. Benjamin Walsh was already there, as were most of the board members. Richard arrived a few moments later, followed by Caroline. "Gentlemen, ladies," Madison began, keeping her voice steady. "I believe you've all seen the press speculation." "Speculation?" One of the older counselors, Peterson, interrupted. "We have photographic evidence of secret meetings between the Sterling brothers before the takeover. How can we be sure we haven't all been manipulated?" Richard stood up abruptly. "That's absurd. Yes, I met my sister. Yes, we discussed the future of the company. But to suggest that we planned all this, why not?" Peterson insisted. "Its reputation was tarnished after years of controversial management. What better way to reinvent yourself than through apparent defeat and redemption?" Madison watched the scene unfold, her world beginning to spin. Had she been manipulated? Had the last few weeks, the moments with Richard, the kiss, all part of an elaborate plan? "If I may," Caroline interjected, her voice cutting through the tense air like a blade of ice. "I have something to say." She removed an envelope from her briefcase. "These are the complete recordings of all my conversations with Richard over the last 3 months, including our meeting in the cafe." Richard paled. "I'm sorry, Rick," she said softly, "but I always record all my business meetings." "Old custom." Madison watched as Caroline inserted a USB stick into the room's audio system. Richard's voice filled the room. "She's amazing, Care. What Madison did made me realize how much I had lost myself. How much I'd become exactly the kind of executive our father despised." "And now?" Caroline's voice asked. "Now?" I'm learning to be a better man. And maybe she's the reason I had to lose everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Madison looked at Richard, seeing vulnerability and truth in his eyes. "There's more," Caroline continued, standing up. "I'm not only keeping my shares in Vertex, but increasing my stake. And I suggest the board does the same." Benjamin Walsh smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, that certainly clears a few things up." The meeting ended an hour later, with the board voting unanimously to maintain the current management structure. As the executives left, Caroline stopped next to Madison. "He really loves you, you know," she said softly. "I'd never see my brother like this for anyone." Madison nodded, unable to speak. When everyone had left except Richard, she finally allowed herself to breathe. "Why didn't you tell me about meeting your sister?" she asked. Richard approached her slowly. "Because I was embarrassed. That day, for the first time in years, I admitted out loud that I had become someone I despised, and that an extraordinary woman was showing me a way back to the person I used to be." He took her hands, and Madison felt the familiar warmth of his touch. "I didn't plant any of this, Madison. How could I? You came into my life like a hurricane, tearing down all my defenses, all my walls. And now, she whispered, now I just want to build something new. Something real. With you." Madison felt tears in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief and joy. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? The press, the shareholders." Richard smiled, that smile that made her heart melt. "Since when do you care about what's easy? You're Madison Carter, the woman who turned a humiliating dismissal into an empire." "And you're Richard Sterling," she replied, smiling through her tears. "The man who discovered that losing everything could be the start of something much better." When he kissed her, right there in the meeting room, where their story had begun, Madison knew that some truths are too strong to be denied. Even in the ruthless world of business, sometimes the heart knows better than reason. 3 months after the headline scandal, Vertex Investments was unrecognizable. Under the joint leadership of Madison and Richard, the company's shares had risen by 45%. The Wall Street Journal, which had previously speculated on conspiracies, now called them Chicago's golden couple. Madison watched the city from her office window, remembering how everything had changed. The framed lottery ticket on her wall, her first act of defiance against fate, seemed to smile at her. "Thoughtful?" Richard's voice surprised her. He was leaning against the doorframe, more relaxed than she had ever seen him in a suit. "Just reminiscing," she smiled, gesturing for him to come in. "It's exactly a year since you fired me," Richard grimaced, stepping closer. "My biggest mistake and the best decision of my life, apparently." "What do you mean?" "If I hadn't been an arrogant jerk that day," he explained, stopping behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, "you would never have bought that lottery ticket. You would never have come back to change my life." Madison leaned back against him, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. "Sometimes, I wonder if people still think it was all planned." "Madison," he began, but was interrupted by Ashley rushing into the office. "Sorry," she said, noticing the intimacy of the moment. "But you need to see this." She turned on the television in the living room. On CNBC, a familiar face filled the screen. Theodore Maxwell, former vice president of Vertex and staunch Madison opponent. "I question the stability of a company where the romance between CEO and COO clearly influences corporate decisions," Maxwell declared. "The recent merger with Maxwell Industries was rejected without adequate consideration, purely for personal reasons." Madison felt Richard tense up behind her. Maxwell Industries, Theodore's family company, had made an aggressive merger proposal the previous month, a proposal that Madison and Richard had unanimously rejected because they identified predatory clauses in the contract. "He's trying to manipulate the market," Richard muttered. The stock is already down 3% since the interview began. Madison, Ashley interrupted again. Benjamin Walsh is on line 1. And Caroline is arriving in 15 minutes. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy meetings and press releases. Maxwell had begun an aggressive campaign, using his relationship with Richard as ammunition against the company's management. One particularly tense evening, Madison found Richard on the terrace of the building, looking out over the city. "Hey," she called softly. "I thought you'd already gone home." "I was thinking," he replied without turning around. "Maybe I should get away." Madison felt her heart freeze. "What do you mean?" "Maxwell is right about one thing." Richard finally turned to face her. "Our relationship complicates things. Maybe if I renounced—" "No," Madison interrupted him firmly, stepping closer. "I'm not going to let you destroy what we built professionally or personally because of corporate gains." "But no buts." She grabbed his hands. "Remember what you told me in that meeting room? That some truths are too strong to be denied?" Richard nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Then trust me," Madison continued. "I have a plan." The next morning, Madison called a press conference in the Vertex lobby. With Richard at her side, she faced dozens of cameras and journalists. "Recently, our professional integrity has been questioned due to my relationship with Richard Sterling," she began, her voice firm. "So let me clarify a few things." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "Yes, Richard and I are together. And yes, we work together. But do you know why that works? Because before we're a couple, we're professionals who put this company first. And we have the results to prove it." Madison nodded to Ashley, who projected graphs onto the screens behind her. "In the last 3 months, we've increased our profitability by 45%. We've expanded into 3 new markets. And most importantly, we've kept 98% of our customers, the highest retention rate in Vertex's history." She smiled, feeling Richard's hand discreetly touch her back in support. "As for the Maxwell Industries proposal, we rejected it because it was detrimental to our shareholders. The full proposal documents are being made publicly available as we speak, so everyone can judge for themselves." The final bombshell came from Caroline, who took to the stage next. "As chairman of the board," she announced, "I am pleased to report that we have just closed a strategic partnership with Walsh Group that will make Vertex the largest investment manager in the Midwest." The market responded immediately. Vertex shares soared, and the hashtag power couple became a trend on social media. Later, alone in Madison's office, Richard pulled her into a passionate kiss. "You're amazing, you know that?" he murmured against her lips. "We're amazing," she corrected, smiling. "Together." At that moment, looking into the eyes of the man who had gone from her tormentor to her partner in every way, Madison knew she had won something much more valuable than a lottery. She had won a love that defied all odds. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow Richard had a surprise plan that would change their lives once again. But that was a story for another time. The sun was rising over Chicago when Madison arrived at the office that morning. For some reason, Richard had insisted that she meet him before normal working hours, citing an important meeting with international investors. The building was silent, except for the soft sound of the air conditioning. When the elevator doors opened on the 47th floor, Madison stopped in surprise. The entire office was dark, lit only by dozens of electric candles scattered across the floor, creating a path to her office. "Richard?" she called out, her heart racing as she followed the illuminated path. Arriving at his office door, Madison found an envelope attached to the doorknob. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the report that had caused her dismissal a year ago. "Come in," Richard's voice sounded from inside the room. As Madison opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. The office had been transformed. On the walls, photos told his story. The day of the hostile takeover, his first meeting as CEO, the ball at the Metropolitan, the press conference. And at the center of it all, Richard, wearing the same suit he wore the day he fired her. "What's all this?" she asked, thrilled. "A year ago," Richard began, stepping closer, "I made the biggest mistake of my life in this very room. I humiliated the most extraordinary woman I've ever met because I was blinded by power and pride." He took her hands, continuing, "But the universe has an interesting sense of humor. That mistake led me to the greatest gift of my life, you." "Richard, wait," he smiled, that smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Let me finish." He let go of her hands and walked over to the window, where the sun was now painting the Chicago sky in shades of pink and gold. "Do you know what impresses me most about you, Madison? It's not that you won the lottery. It's not that you took over the company. It was your ability to see beyond appearances, to see the man behind the corporate monster I had become." Richard turned to face her, his eyes shining with restrained emotion. "You didn't just make Vertex a better company, you made me a better man. And now," he took a deep breath, reaching into his jacket pocket, "now I want to spend the rest of my life giving back." Madison brought her hands to her mouth as Richard knelt down, revealing a small velvet box. "Madison Carter," he smiled, opening the box to reveal a solitaire diamond ring. "Would you do me the honor of being my wife?" Before she could answer, the lights came on, and applause erupted around the room. Ashley, Caroline, Benjamin Walsh, and the entire Vertex executive team emerged from their hiding places. "Did you all know?" Madison asked, laughing through her tears. "Why do you think I was so insistent that you arrive early today?" Ashley blinked. Madison turned her gaze to Richard, still kneeling, waiting patiently for his answer. "Did you really choose this place to propose to me?" she teased, pointing to the office where it all began. "I thought I'd be poetic," he replied, his green eyes dancing with amusement. "Besides, we've already proved that the best stories can start in the most unlikely places." Madison moved closer to him, touching his face gently. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." As Richard slid the ring onto her finger, Madison thought about how surprising life could be. A year ago, she had left that same office humiliated and defeated. Today, she was there as CEO, engaged and, most importantly, completely in love. Caroline was the first to hug them. "Welcome officially to the family, Madison," she smiled. "Even if you've proven yourself to be a sterling long before this ring." Benjamin Walsh raised his glass of champagne. "To the first Vertex CEO who managed to do the impossible, tame Richard Sterling." "Hey!" Richard protested, pulling Madison closer. "I won her over." "Keep believing that, darling," Madison laughed, kissing him softly. Later, when the celebrations were over and they were alone in the office again, Madison found another envelope on her desk. Inside was the lottery ticket that had changed her life, now framed in an elegant frame. "So we never forget how it all began," Richard said, hugging her from behind. "And how sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as defeats." Madison turned in his arms, looking at the man who had gone from her greatest enemy to the love of her life. "You know what's funny? Even with all the lottery money, you ended up being my biggest prize. And you, Madison Carter Quasi-Sterling, were my biggest windfall." As the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, illuminating the start of another day, Madison thought about how unpredictable life was. A year ago, she had entered that building determined to take revenge on the man who had humiliated her. Today, she walked out with a ring on her finger and the certainty that sometimes love has very peculiar ways of finding us. And what about Vertex? Well, with Madison and Richard side by side, both in life and in business, the future never looked brighter. After all, Some stories are destined to have a happy ending even if they start off in the most unlikely way possible.